From your subject, from where you're shooting to where the subject is. What's another one?
F-stop.
F-stop. What's another one?
Focal length.
Millimeter of the lens, focal length. Anybody know the last one?
Distance between your subject and the background?
Nope.
No.
It's a tricky one. You can't change it much, so rarely you do it. Your sensor size. If you have a full frame sensor or a crop sensor. The reason that affects it is to take the same picture, if it's a full frame, you're going to move in closer. So you're changing your distance to it. If you've got a crop sensor to get that same image size, you have to back up.
Technically, you're changing the distance. You're not changing, the sensor isn't doing it. It's just your distance away
Distance
to
to
get the
it.
same proportion.
But
You're changing your focal length.
yeah,
What was the first two again?
your aperture, your f-stop, your distance to your subject, and the millimeter of the lens. So first we'll talk a little about f-stop. You know, when you selected your f-stop or an aperture for shooting in that, you are selecting what your depth of field for a big part of it's going to be. So we're going to just kind of run through a little scenario. Let's say we're at the, you're taking a family picture down Riverfront Park, the sun's going down, you've got that perfect golden light. You want to get the best quality possible, so you set your camera to ISO 100 or 200. The wind's blowing a little bit, you kind of want to stop things and no one's standing perfectly still for you. So you're going to shoot at a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. You went to shutter priority and the camera came up and said f4 is what the f-stop is to give you a proper exposure. You're about 10 feet away from your subject. You're shooting, this time, a Canon, for you Nikon shooters, that has the 1.6 crop sensor. And you're shooting with your 50mm lens. You can go to tons of different websites. You can go to, there's a lot of different apps out there. You can bring up your depth of field tables. And basically what you do at the top of the table, you'll put in what camera you're using. And they've got them all listed, like this table is for the Canon Rebel T4i, T3i, T3, T2i, T1i. It'll ask you then what millimeter lens are you using. And in this one, as I grab the right page here, a 50mm lens. Then over on the left, how far you are from whatever you're photographing, wherever you're putting your focus dot. So in this case, we said we're 10 feet away. Well, at 10 feet, if you go across to the column where it says F4, you'll see that everything between 9 feet 2 and 11 feet will be in focus. Which means you've got 1 foot 10 inches or about 11 inches either side of what you're focusing on. When you focus on something, your depth of field is 45 or 65, 45. Think of it as 50-50 because you're not going to split tenths of an inch normally. So if you're thinking 50-50 for a real easy way to think of it, whatever your depth of field comes out to, divide that in half. Meaning if you put the focus dot on me, half going forward, half going back. So if I'm shooting a family with this, I only have 11 inches depth of field. So if I put the focus dot on me and somebody standing behind me, they cannot be in focus because I'm more than 11 inches thick, unfortunately. If you stack, 2 or 3 people one behind the other, you can see, just like in our depth of field where we deliberately blurred things, your people in the back row are going to be blurred. No matter what shutter speed you shot at, because they're not in the depth of field. So in that case, your shot will not work. So you say, okay, I need more depth of field. So you cranked your ISO up to 1,000, and then the camera told you, well, gee, now you can shoot at f11. As you increase your f-stop number, decreasing the hole in your lens, because we know that as we go higher in f-stop numbers, the opening in the lens goes down. As you decrease the hole in the lens, as far as how you're thinking about it, you'll go across from 10 feet to under f11. You'll see everything from 7 feet, 11.4 inches to 13 feet 6 inches will now be in focus, which means you have 5 feet 5 inches depth of field, or about 2.5 feet either side of what you're focusing on. Still not great for a family portrait. You're still fighting the sides of it.
But if you have an ISO of 1,000, isn't that going to be noisier than all get out?
Depending on the camera. Some you can shoot at 1,000, and then just in Lightroom or any of the programs, you won't even see the noise. Depends on your camera. Some of the Nikons are, I know, really good for noise, even if you had to go up to 1,000, and so are some of the Canons and that. Millimeter of the lens. So you say, well, gee, I remember from one of the classes that wide-angle lenses give me a little better depth of field. So you pull off your wide-angle or your 50mm lens, stick on the wide-angle lens, you go back down to your ISO 100 or 200, and it comes back to saying f4. So if you turn the page to the next one, you'll see at the top it says 35mm, the very top of the page up here. And if you went then across 10 feet away, f4, you just jump from, that you had before, let's see, 1 foot 10 inches, you go now to 8 feet 5 inches to 12 feet 4. You just gained, now you have 3 feet 11 inches, or about 2 feet. So anytime you go to a wider angle lens, you get more depth of field for the same f-stop. Now, you're down at the park and Les shows up. And you say, boy, I'm going to get a really good shot now. I'm going to grab his 800mm lens, because he's not looking. And I'm going to back up 50 feet away at f4 and get my picture that I want. So if you go to the third page, and this is what gets so many people in trouble with telephoto lenses, you really reduce your depth of field. If you go to that page and look at 50 feet away with that 800mm lens at f4, his depth of field is 49 feet 11 inches to 50 feet. 1 inch depth of field, even though he's 50 feet away. That is so common. People will switch to a 200 lens, because most of us have 70 to 200 lenses. They zoom in, they're 10, 12 feet away, and they're going to get this beautiful headshot. They focus on the nose of the person or on the chest, and the face is not sharp and clear. The reason is their depth of field is 1 to 2 inches. It's not enough to get the whole face in focus. So when you're shooting, you want to think about, what is my depth of field going to be? So let's say you put back on your 50mm lens, and you back out to 30 feet away. You set your ISO up to 800, and that gives you a f-stop of f8. So we'll go back to our one that says 50mm on the top, go out to 30 feet, go across to f8, and you'll see you have 14 feet 8 inches to 31 feet 8 inches. So you've got 17 feet depth of field, or about 8.5 feet either side of whatever you're focusing on. Now you can easily take a family portrait. You can go to dofmaster.com, which is in the top corner up here, and put in any camera you want, any lens, distance. They will give you individual calculations, or you can pull on the table and look at it that way. But by doing this, you'll start to realize what you're getting when you're shooting, whether you want shallow depth of field or a lot of depth of field. But if you don't know basically where your camera is or what you're getting, it's just a toss-up. So you should know if you grab your wide-angle lens and you're back 15 feet away or 10 feet away and you're shooting f8, that you probably have almost everything in focus. And if you grab your 200 millimeter lens and zoom in and creep in to get a nice head and shoulder shot at, let's say, 8-10 feet, you're probably working down to 1 inch, 2 inches if you've opened up to 2.8 because it's lower light and room. You need to kind of get with whatever lens you work with the most, look at the chart once or twice and kind of see where you're at. Or after you've taken a picture, just to review it with yourself, and I do this off and on, I'll shoot a picture and say, oh, I know I shot that when I'm about 10, 12 feet away. My metadata in the camera will tell me, yeah, you shot it at 5, 6. And it's like, okay, and I know what lens I was using. So I will guess, I think I have 2.5 feet depth of field on this picture. Well, one day when I'm sitting around bored, not doing anything, I'll pull up my depth of field chart for that camera with that lens and say, how close was I? If I'm, 1.5 to 3, I got pretty close. But if I was 2 inches, it's like, oh boy, I really messed that up. Because I don't realize where my lens was focusing as far as the depth. Or if it said I had 15 feet, it's like, oh, that's why all the little junk in the background showed up that I didn't want. So by reviewing your charts off and on and just get, we don't, or I don't ever expect you to memorize the chart. But you should have an idea what will give you what. Just as a ballpark, so you kind of know what you're going to get when you're shooting. If there's something very specific you want, when we did the bridal shoot, we actually brought a tape measure and said, okay, we know our subject's going to be here. We know we want a relatively shallow depth of field, but we need at least 1 foot to get the whole head in. So marked back and said, okay, at 8 feet away, if I shoot at f6 or f11 here, I know I've got enough depth of field. Or if I back up 6 more feet. Shoot it a few times that way, looking down once in a while to say, oh, better watch out, I'm getting too close. It doesn't take long where you don't have to do that anymore. You can just automatically know when I'm getting in close, watch out for this. Knowing that your depth of field goes forward and aft of whatever you're focusing on, if you're going to shoot a group of 3, let's say, maybe you want to focus on the person in the center, not the one in the front of the pile, because you just gave away half of your depth of field, unless you don't like the person in the back row. Then it's great to focus on the person in the front row. But otherwise you want to pick the person in the middle row so that the depth of field goes both directions. Any questions on that?
I just have a question about the background. Is it better if you're trying to get a really shallow depth of field, it's better not to have a lot of stuff in the background, right? Or is it, how do you get that really blurred background without a telephoto? Do you have to...
Shallow depth of field and get the subjects as far away from the background as you can. So if we had a lot of crud in the back, let's say of this room, and I was going to photograph you, I wouldn't want to put you where you are now. I may want to bring you up to where Les is up here in the front row, and I back up and shoot, because the more distance between the subject and the background, the more it will fall off. And then of course shoot with the lens more opened up as far as a lower f-stop number so that you get the shallow depth. Any other questions?
I have
Don't
one.
use these as a Bible either. They're guidelines.
Yeah, they're strictly guidelines to get you in the ballpark.
This is probably pretty stupid, maybe it's another class, I don't know, but say you're outside and there's a coyote standing there looking at you. How do you figure out all that fast so you get him before he runs away?
If he's down there away from you, you automatically know your distance to your subject is far, and if you haven't stolen Les's 800 millimeter lens, and you're shooting, let's say, with a 200, before you even went out to shoot, you could look and say, gee, with a 200 millimeter lens, anything more than 50 feet away from me, I'm going to have 10 feet depth of field. So it doesn't matter. And once you kind of know the numbers, then you're not worried about,
takes
am I getting it,
practice.
am I not getting it, is it gonna work? You know, when you're shooting with a wide angle lens quite often, you know, if you're up at, let's say 5.6 or f8, almost everything's gonna be in focus. It just a huge depth of field. But if you're shooting with a really big telephoto lens, it suddenly becomes really critical. Like, I know when Les is out with his, you know, if he misses with that, putting a focal dot on something, he's lost the shot. Because you can see by his coyote picture back here, and he cruise back at warp speeds. Oh, there we go. From one to the next, already completely out of his depth of field. And rarely do you see Les running away from the stuff to get his depth of field. You pay a lot of money to be able to zoom in like that, but you have to pay attention to where you're focusing. So you wouldn't want to, let's say, make maybe all your focus dots active in your camera, because it may find a hunk of ground up here that's hitting a little brush. Focus on that, and both coyotes would look like the back one.
I've done that.
We all have. I guarantee it.
And then the other thing is carry a second camera with a smaller lens so you can, because every once in a while they come close enough to where you can't shoot anymore. And I was in shooting foxes 2 years ago, and there was another guy that was shooting. For some reason I didn't take my second camera in the 100 to 400. The fox got so close, I just turned the lens down, watched it, and the other guy, he was probably 100 yards away from me, and he was using a 100 to 400 lens on a Nikon. So he took pictures of me with the fox just 25 yards away, just walked right in front of me. I couldn't shoot anymore with that. And my zoom is, that 800 is a 300 to 800. I was all the way down to 300. I couldn't shoot because he was just so close.
Wow.
I shoot rodeos at the Metro all the time, and in the arena and I've got a 300 2.8 lens because the light's terrible in there. But if we don't get them coming right out of the chute, they're already coming too much towards you that you can't get the whole animal in your depth of field. Shooting a 2.8 with a 300, so you know you got to have a second lens to switch to or another camera to grab to keep shooting, because you just can't get it. You'll end up with, you know, half the horse or half the bull completely blown out, and it's like nobody wants that picture.
Yeah.
Warren is really good at explaining this, so keep pestering him because he'll develop more questions. And I appreciate you bringing it up tonight, and I think it's one of those things that you ought to cover about every other time, because you just forget and it spoils things that could be better. But in my experience, you don't get to make all kinds of thoughtful decisions like you would in a studio. So generally speaking, if you can get used to the idea, do I want more depth of field in this image, or do I want less? And that's the only two questions. Most of the other decisions are already made for you because of lighting conditions. So very often you'll end up with very shallow depth images because you're wide open, because you need to gather light. And you'll manage that as best you can. Accuracy with your focal dot is important in those conditions. So if you want a deeper depth of field under low light conditions, that's not an option available to you. So you won't be making a DOF decision in those conditions. If you've got tons and tons of light and you just be a little bit thoughtful, am I going to play in the shallow end or am I going to dive in the deep end? Those things are helpful. But mostly you don't get to make 6 or 8 decisions before you snap it. It's action photography, whether it's streetscapes or your kids playing in the yard or something like that. You just don't have that kind of time. But when you do, to Warren's point, if you just get used to the rhythm of what am I trying to get here? Do I need kind of shallow or do I need deeper? That's really helpful. And then exactly what he said, just review the tables once in a while. Pick your favorite focal length and look at them and just kind of get a rough idea of where you are. But great idea.
I mean, for me, I know I shoot a lot of portraits, and I love to zoom in with my 200. But I've learned that when I'm shooting head and shoulders and filling the frame with head and shoulders with the 200, I'm working with about 2 inches depth of field. So if I'm shooting at 2.8, which my lenses all go to 2.8. So it's like, I don't want to do that in a portrait situation because I know that I normally want more than 2 inches. So I make sure that, you know, I'm using my studio strobes, or if I'm outside, I'll use, you know, sometimes a softbox, or I'll increase the ISO just a little bit so I get, you know, a little more depth of field. If I'm backed off to my 70 and I'm shooting one person, I know I'm covered and I'm good to shoot, and I don't have to think about it anymore. But it just, you know, gets you in the ballpark. Nobody that I know of memorizes the tables or, you know, brings them along all the time to shoot. But when you're practicing, you know, and I do this often, I'll print out the tables that I did when we did the bridal shoot, and then show up and say, okay, you know, I'm going to shoot this. And while I'm practicing, I go, I think I've got this much depth of field, and I'll look at the chart and go, oh, yeah, I'm kind of close, or wow, did I miss that? I thought I had a lot more or a lot less. It's like, that's good to know. And then, you know, press on shooting, and it saves you so much headaches down the road later if you get where you kind of know where your lenses are. You know, I know Les knows with that 800mm lens, if he opens it all the way up, he can't just generally pick anything and hope that it's going to be in focus.
Well, just like on the coyote picture, if you noticed what my shutter speed was, I could have closed down that aperture some more and maybe got that second coyote. But I hopped out of the vehicle and it was close and I was trying to get it, and I didn't even look at the shutter speed. I could have closed down a couple more stops, got more depth of field on that.
It was neat the way you got it.
See, and I like it like that more than if the second one would have been in focus.
Yeah.
But that's another point is sometimes you get so excited about shooting, it's like you don't look at your settings down below, and every once I catch myself, and on this picture here, I usually, when I go out, my initial settings are 5.6, ISO 400, and then on some of the pictures that I posted, you'll see a +2 EV or whatever, and I did that because of the snow. And then I had some that set +2 and they were blown out, so.
Yeah, it varies. But yeah, if you shoot much sports, stuff like that, you typically want the subject, and you lose the background as much as you can, for sports especially, because you don't want to see the bleachers and everybody's sharp detail, because you find people then searching instead of looking at the subject.